Good morning to those of you who are entering the Zoom chat. We are just going to give it a minute or so for people to enter the Zoom room, and we'll get started momentarily. Just be patient, please. Good morning. If you'll just be patient with us just a minute, it takes a couple minutes for everybody to load into the Zoom chat. So just give us a second and we'll be with you momentarily. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. We hope you are all doing well and maybe seeing some loosening of restrictions where you live. This is our 10th webinar discussing COVID-19 and trade, and we'll continue to try to do these sessions as long as it's not safe for us to hold live and in-person gatherings in Washington, D.C. Glad to be able to bring the global trade community back together again for these webinars. We have, for most of our sessions, over 400 viewers in over 20 countries, and we're delighted to have all of you together, even in this virtual setting. Next week, June 4th, we've got an all-star panel to discuss implementation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, USMCA, which has also been impacted by COVID-19 and enters into force on July 1st. Note, please, that that session starts at 10:30 in the morning, not our usual 11 o'clock time. Also next week, we're going to be hosting a one-on-one discussion with Congressman Ron Kind, a member of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. That will be on Wednesday, June 3rd at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, if you have any trouble with your connection, you can try WITA's YouTube stream. You can watch it there. After a discussion with our panelists, we'll try to turn to questions. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, there's a Q&A function on your screen, and you can use that to submit questions to our our panelists, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. For those of you who did register on Zoom, you should have received an email a little while ago with biographies and today's event program. Really glad to have you all here today, sort of inviting you inside the tent with some of the Washington, D.C. trade insiders who've been giving a lot of thought on trade policy and trade negotiations, and we're really privileged to have them here to share their current thoughts on the trade agenda. First of all, welcome to Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute, our partner in this series. Wendy published a paper on Tuesday, I believe, on moving WTO negotiations into a digital world, and her co-author, Nigel Corey, is with us to discuss their insights. We'll also get to hear from two longtime Washington trade insiders who bring years of expertise and insights to the table, so to speak. Mark Linscott was Assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs the last time there was a transition of leadership at the WTO. His recent paper on transformation of the multilateral trading system helped inspire today's event. And my old friend and one of my own mentors, Terry Stewart, a longtime and influential trade lawyer whose blog Current Thoughts on Trade has become must-reading on US and global trade policy. We actually feature his blog on the WITA site and encourage you to subscribe to his regular updates on the pressing trade issues. So thanks and welcome Wendy, Mark, Terry, and Nigel. Wendy, take it away.
Well, thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. We've got an incredible panel today, and what's interesting, we're going to focus on the WTO, but we're going to focus on two challenges which have emerged recently and really haven't been under a lot of discussion yet, but both require urgent attention. The first is the selection of a new Director General of the WTO, and the second is the need for the WTO to go digital. With respect to the first topic, with the announcement earlier this month by Roberto Azevedo, the current Director General of the WTO, a process has been set in train to find a successor for him. Azevedo has announced he plans to leave the WTO by the end of August, And so this is a very short period before us. The WTO has announced a window for applicants opening on June 8th. It will be a month-long window with the deadline July 8th for applicants to submit their applications. And this comes at a critical time for the WTO. We've discussed before in many of these webinars the fact that the dispute settlement, the negotiating, and the monitoring functions of the WTO are under serious strain. And the selection of the DG brings to the forefront a discussion on how members see the WTO evolving and regaining its relevance. This is going to be a consuming process. I've seen it firsthand during my days at USTR on a number of occasions. And often it derails focus on substance as everyone really hones in on who the new Director General should be. So that's one topic. The second topic is this need to go digital. And if I've counted right, I think in Washington, D.C., we're at the end of week 11 of telecommuting. And at least for me, when we started this, I thought we'd be back in the office in 2 or 3 weeks. And now what we're hearing is we don't know when that might happen. And that's just not for the US alone. We've seen travel restrictions all around the world. And it's uncertain when in-person meetings are going to resume internationally. And even once they do, I think it's safe to say that we're in a new digital world, and many of the meetings that many of the meetings and panels and sessions that we engage in, and even negotiations, will be held digitally. The WTO seems to kind of be behind other international organizations in embracing technology for its work. And we're going to look into that today. Why is the WTO behind other international organizations? What can they learn from other international organizations? And how can they move forward from a technical point of view towards the digital world? Now, we also recognize there are political considerations in this as well, and we'll get to that. So those are the two issues we want to focus on. We have an incredible panel today, as Ken just mentioned, to discuss these issues. And so let me start with my former colleague, Mark Linscott. Ken had mentioned that Mark was head of the WTO office at USTR during the last full selection process in 2003, when Azevedo was selected. And so Mark, wondering if you can share with us some insights into that process, what worked, what didn't work, and your views on whether the full 9 months of this process is needed, or can this process be truncated? So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Wendy, and thanks to you and Ken. It's great to be here. I might note that that you, Wendy, brought me into multilateral work when you recruited me into the GATT Affairs Division at the Commerce Department in the late 80s when we were both there. So, in terms of the DG process, the last time this happened, it was end of 2012, first part of 2013. It frankly was a complicated and tedious process, but ultimately hugely successful. There were 9 candidates nominated at the time. One from a developed country, that was Tim Grosser from New Zealand. Another from an undeclared developed country, that was the Trade Minister Park from Korea at the time. And the other 7 candidates from developing countries and representative of the developing world. 2 from Africa, 1 from South America, 1 from Central America, 1 from Asia, the Middle East. So, it was a true geographic array of individuals. And, from a USTR perspective and a US government perspective at the time, I recall that we did not have specific red lines in terms of those candidates. A number of them were certainly highly qualified. We had a sense of some initial preferences and a sense of those that that might not be ideal, but that was mainly on the basis of whether an individual might have his or her own agenda that might be brought into the role of Director General. We were certainly looking for somebody who was more of a facilitator, a trusted broker, than an individual who would have an agenda to press. It was a relatively transparent process. There was roughly a month after the nominations were in, there was a 2 or 3 day meeting in Geneva with the General Counsel, in which each nominee was able to present him or herself. It was a bit of a marathon. It was at least on the U.S. side referenced as the beauty contest at the time. It was staged in 3 rounds. After this presentation of credentials by the individuals, the chairman of the General Counsel at the time conducted a series of so-called confessionals with individual delegations. He had asked that delegations present their top 4 preferences among the 9 without ranking them. After that first series of confessionals, the group was winnowed down from 9 to 5. Those that did not appear to have a credible chance at getting a consensus were asked to step down. After the 5 had been identified, there was another series of confessionals, and in those confessionals, delegations were asked individually to present their top 2 preferences, and that ultimately led to 2 final candidates, and those were Roberto Acevedo from Brazil and Herminio Blanco from Mexico. And both were hugely qualified. They each presented specific attributes. Roberto, well known, he was ambassador for Brazil in Geneva at the time. He had lots of Geneva experience. In fact, he and I had served together in Geneva in the late 90s when he was a first secretary at that time. So a huge amount of WTO experience. Herminio Blanco had been a longtime trade minister for Mexico. He had been involved in the Uruguay round. He had been involved in NAFTA, but he'd been in the private sector for the last 12 years. So he was, in some respects, less well known by the Geneva delegations. Ultimately, Roberto was chosen, and I think we all felt like we chose well. 4 months after he was in place, we had a very significant ministerial conference take place in Bali, Indonesia, and it was seen as an opportunity for the WTO, after years of being stuck in the Doha round, to finally move forward and accomplish something. And he really did a remarkable job in bringing countries together, delegations together, to conclude a trade facilitation agreement. I can recall being with Michael Punk and Mike Froman at the time. Roberto in Bali. Roberto engaged in shuttle diplomacy over 2 nights between our delegation and the Indian delegation to get a solution on public stockholding on agriculture that would allow the trade facilitation agreement to move forward. So clearly we did choose well, and it's sad to see him move on. Now, I will just quickly note, I'll contrast this with what happened in 1999. At that point in time,
we can wrap this up soon so we can turn to the next speaker.
Yeah, no, in 1999, there was, a compromise reached, but it was an ugly one. It was divisive. It was just before Seattle, and, soon after that, we had the breakdown in Seattle. So, going forward, I'm hopeful, confident that we will have more of a process like we had in 2013.
Well, thank you. And I do recall us calling it like a beauty pageant. And I remember being in many meetings where some of these 9 folks would actually come visit Washington to, explain their views and kind of try and gain our support. And I assume in this COVID world, at least, that travel's not going to be allowed. So that might be one way how this timeline could be condensed. But we'll follow up in a minute. But let me turn to Terry Stewart now. Terry, I'm going to ask you if you could share with us, as best you can, the US perspective on selecting a new DG. I think there was a sigh of relief when people read Ambassador Lighthizer short statement after the announcement by Azevedo, when he said he looked forward to participating in the process for selection of the new DG. But I'd be interested in your take on what you think the US will be looking for, and whether the US is really serious about trying to find a Director General within a truncated period of time.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to you and Ken for including me. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think for the United States, which has had an active reform agenda for the WTO, that's dissatisfied with a lot of what's going on there, but has also been putting forward a lot of fairly aggressive proposals for change, that for them, I would have to believe that they're looking for a Director General has the capability to do what Mark described Director General Azevedo doing in Bali, which is finding a path forward in what seems to be impassable waters. So I would think that their main concern would be with that versus geographical location. Within the procedures that were adopted in 2002 and came into effect for the first time in the selection of Lamy in 2005, you're supposed to look for the most qualified. As you indicated, Wendy, there is a window after nominations conclude when the nominees have a chance to go and make themselves known. And while the Geneva process is important, of course, at the end of the day, most of the thumb direction comes from capitals. And I think with both Lamy's case and in the 2012, 2013, you had a 3-month time period that is built into the procedures where candidates were doing a lot of globetrotting. You correctly identify that globetrotting is not likely to be possible in 2020. And that probably means that when you get to the end of July, when there should be a general council meeting for whatever number of candidates have come forward to be heard, it will have to be done virtually, which kind of ties into your second issue of having the WTO move to the digital age. So my guess is that the United States will be looking at who comes forward. They may work behind the scenes to encourage some countries to put people forward. I do not believe that the United States will put anyone forward themselves. We've not historically done that. And while it is not part of the procedures, there has been a view in Geneva, certainly there was in 2012, 2013, that it was time to move from a developed country to a developing country. Obviously, Europe has already laid down a marker that they view it as time for there to be a developed country leader. So that's a political issue, not a substantive issue in terms of the qualifications of the individuals. But if that turns out to be the case, then you will have, I think, a relatively small pool of candidates who come forward from developed countries. We know that there's a lot of interest in it within Africa to put forward one or more candidates. And there's a number of people whose names have been out there, at least one of whom was nominated back in 2012. So we'll have to see how broad a group it is. I think that you're probably correct that if there is going to be a truncation of the 6-month time period to go from start to quote unquote the selection, that the only soft underbelly is probably month 3, since month 2 and 3 are what typically are used by the candidates to get out to capitals, and we'll have to figure out some other way to do that through virtual meetings, et cetera. So I think that that will be the process. Some of the concerns that are out there is there's never been a woman Director General, and so you see some of the names being floated around, both from Africa and out of Europe, are qualified women. And I know from talks with friends in Geneva that there has not been a breakthrough as yet in terms of whether there will be any expedition from the 9 months to a shorter time period. But the reality is that the selection to decision is supposed to be a 6-month time period. The last 3 only really relevant if you have a Director General who is in place for kind of a more orderly transfer after a new Director General is selected. So if the United States finds within the candidates put forward somebody who they believe will be successful in moving forward reform, then I believe that you'll see the United States get behind that candidate and work to build a coalition to support that candidate's prospects.
Just a quick follow-up for you, because I know you have read the 2002 process that was agreed to by WTO members in detail. Can you just remind us what happens if Azevedo leaves on August 31? Who the acting DG would be? I think there are procedures that you mentioned yesterday.
Yeah, the procedures that were adopted include the possibility of a vacancy, such as in this case Azevedo leaving early. In which case the General Counsel has to, by consensus, select an acting Director General from the 4 Deputy Director Generals. So one would assume that as soon as they have a clear idea of what the process is going to be and whether there's going to be any expedition for the selection of a new DG, you would think that they would start almost immediately to also weigh the acting DG situation, because very few people believe that they can get this done by the end of August.
Mark, maybe over to you just for a follow-up then. If there were an acting DG for a period of time, what would this mean for the WTO agenda? And specifically in reading your paper, where you really laid out some really impressive and concrete recommendations, would this mean that all of this work would be put on hold?
No, I don't think so. We did have a situation in 1999 where there was this huge controversy between Mike Moore and his supporters and Subuchai from Thailand. And at that point in time, there were no procedures. David Hartridge, who was the senior director in the WTO Secretariat, was acting for 4 or 5 months. And, that was a set. I mean, David was fantastic, an old friend, but that was a setback building up to a huge ministerial, the Seattle ministerial, where there was expectations to launch a new round. This time we've got experienced deputy DGs. If we were in that kind of situation, we don't yet have a date for the next ministerial conference in 2021. I tend to think that would be better later in the year rather than next June. But that's still 6 or more months between selecting a DG and having a ministerial conference. And Roberto only had 4 months. Also, I think that some of the best prospects for agreements or outcomes will be plurilateral ones, and those definitely can proceed. The DG is not directly involved in ongoing plurilateral negotiations like the one on digital. So that work can proceed regardless of the situation with the DG.
Well, great. And that's a great transition for my next question to Nigel Corey. As Ken had mentioned, Nigel and I recently just drafted a paper about the urgent need for the WTO to go digital. And so I would ask Nigel if he can share with us why this is so important and where other international organizations are, and can the WTO learn any lessons from these international organizations, and how the WTO can overcome some of the technical and political challenges that seem to be slowing down its leap to the digital world. Thanks.
Yeah.
Nigel, over to you.
No worries. Thanks, Wendy, and thanks, Ken. It's great to be here today. I mean, COVID-19 essentially requires the WTO to fundamentally change the way it's traditionally done its work in terms of in-person meetings of Geneva-based and capital-based reps and periodic ministerial meetings. But this won't work anymore and won't work for the foreseeable future. I've heard the Swiss government won't allow in-person international meetings until September at the earliest. And this is obviously during a time when the WTO is facing enormous pressure to not only function and remain relevant, but to make this clear in the future by facilitating new agreements and rules through multilateral and plurilateral talks. But unfortunately, the lack of digital readiness and adaptability to digital operations has made all of this that much harder. For example, just as they were building critical momentum towards a sort of end-of-year solution for long-running fisheries subsidies, these have been suspended just as they were getting towards the finishing line. And this is obviously a multilateral talk, but meanwhile, as Mark was saying, joint statement initiatives, so plurilateral talks on domestic regulations and e-commerce, have taken some steps to moving online with webinars, non-negotiating plenary sessions, and small group meetings on specific text proposals. And as Canada's ambassador to the WTO sort of foreshadowed in comments a few days ago, these sort of talks, especially at the e-commerce negotiations, could hold broader significance in that they could be a live experiment for the WTO writ large to look at and learn from. And it really does need to learn some quickly and adapt quickly, as thus far the WTO's use of digital tools has largely been ad hoc. Obviously, officials are using tools for these tools for informal meetings, but it hasn't made the seismic sort of jump that we needed to make. I also think it was a misstep that they cancelled the June ministerial because that stands in contrast to many other international organisations that shifted these sort of critical high-level meetings online. Elsewhere, the WTO did hold, from what we hear, Australia's periodic trade policy review remotely, which reportedly went well. And earlier this month, the General Council held a virtual discussion about COVID-related trade restrictions. And the DG reported that this was well received, but it hasn't outlined sort of any sort of follow-up steps or sort of broader strategy to move forward. And so while the WTO and its members may not be familiar or comfortable with digital operations, other countries and comparable institutions are showing that this work can happen online. The OECD has shifted its negotiations over digital tax issues online, and they've got a steady schedule of meetings going ahead. The ITU and other international organisations that have greater experience pre-COVID of doing things remotely have shifted more so online. Obviously, the UK has launched digital talks with the US, as well as its ongoing talks with the EU. And in comparison, both the US Congress and the UK Parliament have shifted operations online. And while they haven't done so yet, they've started to explore how they could also allow remote voting. And so this shows that digital talks and negotiations involving sensitive issues can be done online. Basically, if there's a will, there's a way. Because tech tools these days are better than ever in that they allow highly accessible, secure, and interactive sort of engagement online. These allow for services to plug in interpreters. I've heard the WTO and other international organisations are using platforms like Interprify, which provide remote simultaneous interpretation for these platforms. But it comes down to sort of setting out a plan to do this and really prosecuting that. And we just haven't sort of seen that commitment, that scoping of options for them to present to their members to sort of make this happen.
Well, thanks for that. Maybe I can turn to Mark and Terry just to see if you have any comments, particularly any insights into why you think that the WTO has been slow to kind of move off the dime towards a digital world. Mark?
Yeah, well, you know, I think you have laid out in your paper just the other day with Nigel, you know, noted some of the you know, the considerations in terms of how the WTO operates and, you know, the dynamic associated with a negotiation. And, you know, the one that is getting so much attention multilaterally, the fisheries subsidies one being, you know, getting to a crunch point, which could be a bit complicated in terms of doing it remotely. You know, that said, though, you know, there have been some delegations, and I think led by India, which have noted that they are not prepared to use digital platforms to reach decisions during this period and to actually conduct negotiations. So that's definitely a constraint, and you know, there is some degree of preoccupation with COVID versus what's happening in the WTO, and that's, you know, the U.S. delegation, Ambassador Dennis Shea, also made that clear in recent days.
Terry, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that where Mark was going, for a lot of the LDCs and some of the developing countries, it's not simply a concern about making decisions virtually. I think it is a concern as well about their ability to interact with their home governments to get the guidance they need to be able to make a decision. And that would be certainly true for a lot of the smaller countries where they have a relatively thin administrative personnel back home. And obviously, depending on the infrastructure needs, et cetera, it could also be just a technical issue for them. But I know that's been a big concern, and you had, when the issue was being decided whether they would accept going digitally or whether they would limit that to putting forward papers but not really making decisions. That seemed to be a recurrent theme from a lot of countries, from Africa and some from Asia in particular.
Yeah, I would also just put on the table something that Mark and Nigel alluded to, and that is that digital negotiations might lend themselves better to earlier stages of a negotiation. But when you're at the end, when important trade-offs need to be made, at least in my world, the in-person venue becomes all the more important, where informal trade-offs can be explored, side meetings can be held, meetings can be broken up, and two delegations can go out and kind of duke it out and come back in. But again, I think what Nigel said is like, you know, if the option is then everything's on hold, that's not a good place to go. And the sophistication of these digital tools, you know, may kind of ease us into those final stages of negotiations, but we're not there yet. And I think it's quite interesting that the OECD, which typically is not a negotiating forum, I think, Nigel, you mentioned, and it's in our paper, that they are proceeding towards their year-end deadline for their digital tax negotiations. Perhaps we can turn just briefly to an issue actually that it's related to the selection of the DG, and Mark had raised in his paper, and that's kind of gets to the role of the WTO Secretariat and the role of the WTO as an organization versus being a member-driven organization. And I think in picking a Director General, that's going to be an important consideration when people look at who they're going to support. Is it someone who's going to work with the member states, the members to get their input and to form consensus, or is it someone who's going to try and put his or her own stamp on outcomes or on negotiations? And I think, Mark, in your paper, you talked about, you know, the WTO Secretariat might be able to contribute more with respect to the monitoring function of the WTO. So I would be interested if any views from the panels on these issues, just more generally, but also how this consideration might play into the selection of a Director General. Terry, any comments?
I think that, as Mark indicated back in 2012, 2013, the United States focus was on finding someone who was a facilitator. That certainly there will be lots of major players who are looking for a facilitator. But the challenges that the WTO has at the moment require leadership. Obviously, that leadership has to come from the members. But there probably is a fine line in terms of a Director General who can anticipate or take the needs of the members into account and help them find a path forward. And so I would think that we will, if we get a Director General who can actually bring relevance back to the work program, it will probably be someone who was more than simply a facilitator, because at the moment we have basically a gridlock amongst the majors in terms of direction and reform that's needed.
Mark, any additions?
Yeah, just quickly. I totally agree with Terry. And again, my experience for much of my career doing multilateral was that that the Secretariat and the DG at the head of it is a facilitator. And in fact, it's in some respects unique among multilateral organization secretariats. And I'm a trade nerd, so it's not surprising that I'd have this subjective perspective, but I think better than other secretariats for that very reason. It is focused on servicing members and expect members to take on the leadership role, and that was a major consideration when Roberto was chosen, and he played an important role. There was a showdown between the U.S. and India. In fact, India and many others in Bali, and it was Roberto, by having finesse and being a trusted broker, that was able to bring the two sides together. He didn't have an agenda he was pressing. So I think Terry's right. It's a fine line.
And before I turn to Ken to ask questions from the audience, Nigel, just a quick question for you. How do you see the role of the WTO Secretariat in helping the WTO go digital?
Yeah, no, I think the Secretariat can play a proactive role in identifying and presenting proposals about how to make the adaptation to digital operations, learning from other international institutions, both in Geneva, but also Brussels and elsewhere, that have been dealing with sort of remote digital participation for some time, and presenting them forward. Obviously, the WTO as an institution can only go as far as its members allow it to in making that adoption, both on a case-by-case basis, but also more systematically. And I've heard that there is a lot of frustration in Geneva at certain delegations, not only India, but also the United States, who are holding back the use of digital tools in certain forums, such as the dispute settlement body, but allowing it to be used in other forums like the plurilateral settings. And so I think in that sort of shows how hard it will be to get sort of unanimous support for broad digital adoption, because essentially the move to digital becomes another veto point in this already highly complicated, politically charged sort of situation that the WTO finds itself in.
Okay, well, thanks. Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to all our discussants. When we were doing a preparatory session yesterday, I felt like we were having like an inside baseball discussion amongst DC insiders, and I was worried sometimes when we do have those kind of conversations, people edit themselves too much when they go in a public forum, and it's not quite as interesting and in-depth and knowledgeable and insightful. And I'm really grateful to all of you for your willingness to share Maybe that's the benefits of having retired from some of your positions in the past and not being as worried about how people might react. Terry, I want to go to you. I mentioned, right at the outset, your blog, Current Thoughts on Trade, is something that has become a real go-to for a lot of us. And I do want to recommend everybody subscribe to that. You can get it directly from Terry, or we also have a place for them on the WITA site. Terry, so there's a couple things going on at once, and I want to bring in a couple of questions. One came from Carl Bushman, who's out in the Midwest, and he asked, why does this matter? Midwest United States, that is. Well, do these developments with the WTO, why do they matter? And I guess it comes in, I don't think Bob Lighthizer invented the phrase, if we didn't have a WTO, we'd need to create one. I don't remember where it came from. I know Bob's been quoted with that line, and you've been someone who's for years been able to be an articulate not spokesperson, but be able to articulate some of the critiques of the WTO. So we've had this problem with the DSU for several years. The United States has been raising these issues literally since 2004, I believe. And Bob Lighthizer was highlighting some of these questions about the DSU as far back as 1995 and 94. So going way back, the concerns about the direction the DSU might take. Those have been building for years. And now we got to the crisis of the WTO with a lack of appellate judges to be able to hear the cases. And now you layer on top of that this transition. Is this, how are these things going to intersect? And are we going to be able to see the sort of reforms we want to see at the WTO, not just a new negotiating round, but the reforms we need to see at the WTO in the midst of these kind of transitions?
Thanks, Ken. I think that the WTO is at a fundamental crossroads. You now have wildly divergent views of its role. If you step back and you ask yourself, what is the value of the WTO? The business community would say that it is predictability, stability, so that they can make investment and marketing and other decisions in their business. If you take a look at Deputy Director Alan Wolf's paper that's up on the WTO website from his presentation to the Korean International Trade Association yesterday, you will see that there are a large number of core principles that undergird what the WTO was created for and what it is supposed to be supportive of. And we have moved away from any number of those. In part, that is due to the much larger success of the WTO in terms of membership, but a membership which at its core has a much different orientation than the original founders of the GATT, right? And before we came on, Wendy raised the element out of Alan's paper on convergence versus coexistence. And if you think about the kind of the root challenge that exists in the U.S.-China relationship, it is the fact that the current rules, as viewed by this administration, do not permit reciprocity in relations between the United States and China. And that's because China has not converged to a market economy, but rather is seeking a coexistence within the WTO of market and non-market economies. So I think there are real challenges. Why it matters, if the person asking questions from the Midwest, whether it's a manufacturing individual or an agricultural individual, the access to markets is obviously important. The access to raw materials is obviously important. Whether you have rules of the road that permit a trade to be conducted with some predictability and some perception of fairness, all of those things have been the undergirding principles of a system that has permitted trade to grow exponentially, which has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and which has contributed to the peace and stability, which was the original concept of the ITO and the GATT back in 1947.
Thank you for that. I want to maybe see if Mark has any thoughts on how we would be able to address some of the WTO reform issues at a time of transition. Do you see that as something that is possible? And then Nigel, I'm going to come back to you with some of the digital questions that have been popping up. But Mark, do you have anything to add on that front?
Yeah, just quickly. So I would look at the WTO in transition and efforts to have outcomes and engage in reform by looking at the discrete areas of dispute settlement, negotiation, and really implementation of existing agreements. And this primarily occurs through the councils and the committees, the elaborate system in WTO. In terms of dispute settlement, I'm not confident that there's going to be a change in the status quo for the foreseeable future, at least with the Trump administration for the moment. I think that countries just have to adapt until circumstances might change. And obviously, the EU with a number of countries. A number of WTO members are moving along in that way, and I think that's positive. On the negotiating side, I believe since Bali in 2013 and Nairobi in 2015, and again today, that the best prospects for new rules for the immediate future is through plurilateral negotiations. And ideally, you can reach new multilateral agreements, and TFA was an example of that. The decision on export measures in agriculture in Nairobi in 2015 was an example of that. Maybe fishery subsidies can be done that way, but I think most near-term outcomes will have to be plurilateral ones, and ideally would be multilateralized at some point in time. And e-commerce is I think leading the way. In terms of implementation, there's been some movement in this respect, and I think that's good in terms of an honest discussion on notification and failures to notify, efforts to counter notify, but it's not an ideal scenario. Basically you've got things getting stuck in committees, and then you've got dispute settlement. There's got to be something in between. I'm not sure what that is. I mean, there were some ideas that perhaps could be mined from the Doha round negotiations. The EU had an idea on non-tariff barriers with a lot of support from others on a horizontal mechanism. USTR hated the idea. Our NAMA market access negotiators hated the idea. Frankly, I thought it was not such a bad one in terms of having facilitators who might look at issues short of dispute settlement, try to bring parties together or WTO members together, expressing some views. I don't think the Secretariat can play that role, but there's the PGE in the SCM agreement, which never did anything, but that was kind of an interesting idea of a group of experts that could play facilitating roles, and that could be important in terms of implementing existing rules.
Thank you, Mark. And I want to kind of pivot a little bit, kind of a two-part question going to Nigel and Wendy, not you as moderator, but you as one of the digital authors and a commentator in your own right on these subjects of kind of moving into a digital negotiating world. I think, Nigel, one of the questions comes in, and it's an interesting one in the sense about it's inequitable to some extent, countries' different access to technology, the ability for them to be able to interact on an equitable way in a digital negotiation platform. How do we address that issue? There's also security issues. I know you brought it up a little bit earlier, but I think that's something. I mean, obviously, countries like the United States, with advisors and a long a history of trade negotiations, have a lot of expertise that they bring to every negotiation, and whether it's virtual or in person, that other countries may simply not have. So that sort of inequitable part of a negotiation already existed. But as far as the technology, it's not a leveler if everyone doesn't have the same access to the same technologies. And then Wendy, I want to get into you about sort of the one-to-one negotiating aspect, but I'll after Nigel's done, I'll get you on that one.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a key point to it, but it's one tied into a central point that Wendy and I make in terms of identifying what can be done and going as far as possible, recognizing that there are limits and restrictions in terms of accessibility, in terms of process, in terms of when digital negotiations lend themselves to making progress and when they may not, in terms of like end stage stuff. But it's about essentially being flexible about how you approach it. And we talk about a flexible use framework in terms of setting up digital protocols for each sort of meeting process or negotiating process to figure out what are the capability amongst the members of that group, what platform, what technology works best for them, what are they familiar with, providing the support and training to help members know how to use them correctly, which sort of goes to the cybersecurity aspect of it, ensuring that they use a platform that is encrypted, ensuring that they use all the administrative controls to make sure that only the right people are in the meeting. And then also being, again, a key is to be flexible in terms of perhaps allowing hybrid arrangements so that you allow some people in the meeting to participate, but then also some remote, depending on the situation. And so it's more about finding out as much as the WTO can about its members and their capabilities, and then putting in place as best they can mitigating action to account for those where there may be a lack of broadband activity or accessibility elsewhere. But they need to do that mapping, and that will provide sort of crucial information for them to map a path forward more broadly in terms of like, where are the members at, what do they need, and what are the options. But they need to start that process. And so they need to get going because the technology is already out there. Wendy and I heard from various country officials that they're using commercial platforms to do these talks, that they're very accessible, that they're secure, but that certain regions or certain members prefer to use certain platforms, so hence the need for flexibility. We also don't know where the technology is going, and we also don't know where the best practices are going in terms of what should the WTO be doing best. And so it's about starting the process, learning along the way, conducting reviews as they do it, and sort of applying those as they move forward.
Thank you, Nigel. And Wendy, I'm going to come to you, and maybe Mark might want to weigh in, both as former negotiators. You know, in a sense, as I'm sitting here listening to this, there's a technology question, but there's also a psychology and a sociology question. I mean, human societies have been organized for millennia around in-person gatherings. I mean, the Greek Forum, I mean, we can go way and before that in many ways. And I've been privileged back when I was a congressional staffer to be an observer at a WTO negotiation on telecom talks. And I remember watching the US delegation and the Europeans sitting facing each other in the WTO's big room. And there was some final issue that had to get resolved. And it was literally like the French were whispering in the ear of the EU delegation, and the US negotiators were looking over their shoulder at their congressional observers, and it was like all this tension, and there was like a motion from like the EU delegation where they just kind of nodded their head a little bit, and US nodded back, and that meant that they had reached an agreement on it. I can't remember what the issue was, but it was some final piece of the puzzle on the global telecom talks. I mean, that kind of thing you can't do digitally. That's an in-person sort of thing. And Wendy, you've told stories about sitting across from negotiators for hours on end, the silence in the room, and how people even just manage the silence when a negotiator is not coming back with something. I mean, all those kinds of dynamics are things that have been built into human interaction for forever. And does it work in a digital platform where we all have to learn essentially a new way to socialize, to talk to each other in a digital way? And I know you're not a sociologist or a psychologist, Wendy, but you have been a trade negotiator, so I imagine there's a lot of those tools you have to deploy.
I think it's a great question. I have to say, a lot of times I felt like a therapist when I was involved in negotiations. I also want to say that, and I keep, anytime this word comes out of my mouth, I try to preclude it. We're going to have to get out of the habit of saying face-to-face meetings or tete-a-tete. I'm using like in person now, But I look forward when, you know, the Washington Post at the end of the year always says, it goes through a bunch of words that are in and out. I think we're going to have a lot of new terminology going into next year. And frankly, I think that's going to have to happen, you know, in negotiations. I mean, I've been in negotiations at the end, and I cannot see how we would have ever concluded the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement or TPP for that matter, had we not all, you know, been in the same hotel, running from room to room, breaking up meetings, having long meetings, meeting with this person, breaking up, going to your minister, all of that. But, you know, as Nigel said, that doesn't mean that it can't happen and there aren't new methods. And I think it's people, I think we just have to remain open, and maybe we'll learn that we can't take it to the complete end, but we can get pretty darn far. I'll also just say, it's not like we haven't used digital at all. I've been on lots of phone calls with my counterparts through the years. I know I've been in, you know, we used to call them the DVCs, late at night with other delegations with the time change in Asia, where we'd be either discussing narrowing differences on a certain issue. Legal scrubs have been done electronically. So, you know, there has been a gradual movement towards this. But I don't have the answers to those last stages, and it's hard for me to get my hands around it. But again, just to echo what Nigel said, what's in our paper, I think we just need to kind of dive in. And then if we get to the point where it really can't be done, so be it. But one thing I've learned, if there's a will, there's a way, and people are very creative and resourceful.
Mark, anything you want to add on that front?
Yeah, I could just jump in. Well, I might start by noting that, you know, at times I may have felt like a therapist. More often, I felt like I needed therapy you know, as a result of negotiation. You know, looking ahead, you know, the plurilateral negotiations, for example, on e-commerce, those can proceed in some form digitally, and I think are already beginning to do that. The multilateral ones, and those really currently are fishery subsidies, which are incredibly complicated negotiations, and you know the efforts on the ag front. You know, at some point in time, there's going to have to be some adaptation in some form. You know, we're still in somewhat early days in terms of adapting to COVID in our daily lives, and now in trade negotiations. You know, our next ministerial conference, we're not in crunch time. You know, we're not in that final give and take. We're not like, you know, Bali over the trade facilitation agreement and public stock holding. You know, that's a year off. And a lot is going to occur during that time. There's going to be a lot of adaptation that occurs. So, you know, I think moving ahead, certainly digitally in some of these negotiations where that's possible and nobody's blocking that possibility. Yeah, ultimately, you know, if it's a multilateral negotiation like fisheries subsidies, you know, there's going to have to be new ways of coming together, and you know, I think new ways of being face to face. We may find that the next ministerial conference has some degree of social distancing and face masks involved, but that can still be face to face.
Well, thank you, Mark, Wendy. I'm going to use the last minute we have, maybe come back quickly to Terry. There was a couple different questions came in about, you know, the U.S. has been reluctant to use digital or video platforms for dispute settlement. Do you have any insights into that or thoughts about why the U.S. may be opposed to certain aspects of this? We've talked about some of the challenges for some developing countries, but it also, word is that there's some reluctance by the U.S. I know you're not a member of the administration, but maybe you have some thoughts on that before we wrap up.
Thanks, Ken. I don't really, I mean, other than the, I would have to look at what cases those are that the U.S. has expressed reluctance to see if the reluctance is perhaps more substantive than procedural. U.S. obviously has been one of the leading countries to push for transparency in the dispute settlement system. And you know, they and the European Union and Canada, if you have two of them in a case together, you typically will be open to the public. So it's not clear what the difference between that and having virtual hearings at a point in time when COVID-19 is preventing in-person in Geneva presentations.
Well, thank you, Terry. Thank you, really, all of you for really insightful and insider conversation. I really appreciate it. There was a question that came in I'm not going to make you guys answer about from Naomi Freeman, who's a DC trade insider, about prana, which is a spiritual breathing exercise. Apparently the Indians, it's an Indian concept in yoga, and apparently it involves the spirit and maybe part of a negotiation. But I'm not going to ask you all to comment on that. I think we've gone deep enough into human nature in this, but really appreciate the thoughtful questions that are coming in. Thank you to all of you for your insights. Really, really grateful. I suspect we'll probably want to have all of you back again. Of course, Wendy will be back with us as a regular participant in this series. We're really grateful to all of you. Thank you, Mark, for joining us. Nigel, for your thoughts. Terry, as always, really grateful to you. Thanks to all of you for watching. I really appreciate it. We look forward to hosting you again. Reminder, next week's session on USMCA implementation is at 10:30 in the morning. Don't want to miss that, and don't want to be late for that. So thanks, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe and be well.
Thanks.